Well, hello, APUSH students, and welcome to Chapter 6 of Time Period 3. It's the final chapter in Time Period 3. So we're going to go over what we've covered so far. In our first two chapters is the French and Indian War and everything leading up to the Revolution. We talked about the Revolution. Now we're going to look at after the Revolution, what happens to our country, how do we get out of the original government that we create, which is the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation, as we know, were revealed in 1777. It's our first constitution. What it does, it really defines the powers of Congress, which are not that much. Most Americans wanted a weak central government, and so that's what the Articles of Confederation gave them. Essentially, it's a reaction to British rule. But under the Articles of Confederation, Congress was essentially able to lead the nation through a revolution, negotiate Treaty of Paris in 1783, and then they also established two things: Land Ordinance of 1785, which sectioned out land and provided homestead laws, set aside sections to provide for public education, as well as the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which gave us rules for admittance of new states. One of the events that happened, I should actually go into Articles of Confederation. It had one house, so it's unicameral. It did not have an executive branch, so there was no president, there was no judiciary. So there was really one of our three branches that we have now set up for our new government. Shays Rebellion is... So there was an economic crisis, and the farmers were the ones that were hit the hardest by the economic crisis. There was a depression after the war. Taxes were high. They had to find ways to pay for the war, and so they raised taxes. And those taxes really hurt farmers the most. Massachusetts government failed to address that issue, and so Daniel Shays and a group of farmers rebelled and shut down debtor courts, stopped auctions of farm. They tried to seize the federal arsenal, but state militia stopped them. What this really did, and what the important part for you guys did, is that it highlighted the government's weakness. So in response, in 1783, 9 states were going to meet to discuss the problems with commerce. However, only 5 states showed up. This is where Alexander Hamilton said we need to schedule a future convention where they were going to have a meeting to discuss and to determine what they're going to do next. So a couple of social effects of the Constitution, or of the Revolution, not Constitution, sorry, is so we know that this revolution was not as drastic as French or Russian revolutions. They didn't behead anybody. There wasn't Robespierre. We didn't have a seizure of property. I shouldn't say that. There was some seizure of property for some of the Tories and Loyalists, but it was very minimal. It did produce a political innovation, which is going to be the Constitution. It also provided some social change, which we'll talk about later. It didn't ban slavery altogether, but it did ban slavery in the Northwest Territory. Any new states that were created north of the Ohio River were going to be anti-slavery and slavery abolished in those states. Some of the other social change, we got rid of aristocratic titles. So now aristocratic, not aristocratic. So you are no longer lords and ladies, no titles of nobility, no primogeniture, which is the inheritance laws for the firstborn son. Women were not really included on a national level, but there were some rights for women on state levels. The idea of pursuing equality is something that we started with the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, and so far in a lot of the essays that I've been reading, people are confusing the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Declaration of Independence is the document that says all men are created equal. It never says that in the Constitution. The Constitution is based off of principles in the Declaration of Independence. However, all men are created equal is not in the Constitution. Most states reduced property holding requirements for voting, so more people were able to vote. Ordinary people could be addressed as Mr. and Mrs., which doesn't seem like a big deal. We address a lot of people as Mr. and Mrs. right now, but that was not the norm. And by 1800, the idea of indentured servitude is basically over. Church and state, most states adopted principles of separation of church and state. So you could not have state religions, even though 3 states did continue to allow churches to receive state support in forms of religious taxes. Here's an example of one of the religious freedom laws enacted by Virginia. If you want to pause it, you can read it. I'm not going to read it out loud to you. Women. Women did receive some more equality, but not complete equality under the law. They didn't have political rights. New Jersey did have women allowed to vote, I believe, in local elections, just not national elections. Most women after the Republic or in the new Republic were consigned to the same roles or similar roles that they had fulfilled prior to this: wives, mothers, household managers. They were considered the fairer and gentler sex, but they were also considered the weaker sex. The idea of Republican motherhood is that the importance of women is that they are social keepers of our nation's conscience. They're the ones that are the central figures in the Republican ideology of civic virtue. And again, Republican, I'm not talking about political party yet. We're talking about Republican ideology of civic virtue. Remember, Abigail Adams famously said, "I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors." Remember from Hamilton, the song that we went over for the essay, where we went over the Schuyler sisters, include women in the sequel. This is really what they're talking about. In the new government, we want women to be included in the new government. Slavery. In 1774, the Continental Congress called for complete abolition of slave trade, not slavery. So the idea of getting rid of the slave trade, which is not going to be completely gotten rid of until after 1807, which we'll talk about in a second. It's going to be a compromise that we make. Most northern states abolished slavery prior to this. They really didn't need it. It's not that they were all about equality and all about equal rights. They just didn't need it. Their farm system and what they used did not call for slavery. No state south of Pennsylvania abolished slavery. However, in both the North and the South, laws were created to discriminate against blacks and slaves and free blacks. We're going to look at a quote later on from Calhoun, if I remember right, which basically argues that the slaves have it, or free slaves have it worse in the North than they do in the South. And we're going to argue whether that is true or not. And the Quakers, of course, they're the ones that founded the first anti-slavery society. Why wouldn't they be? James Madison, here's this quote on slavery: "Great is the evil of slavery is, a dismemberment of the Union would be worse." So he is basically arguing, which a lot of people had the same idea, is that slavery is terrible, but the fracture of our country, fracture of our new country especially, would be worse. And he's pretty prophetic in that it's less than 80 years later it's going to happen. So they called a convention, and James Madison, who is widely known as our father of our Constitution, they called a convention to revise their Articles of Confederation. They're not going to create a brand new government yet. They don't want to create a brand new government yet. However, they realize the Articles of Confederation are weak and need change. Each state, with the exception of Rhode Island or Rogue Island, sent delegates. George Washington was elected as the chairperson. He obviously is the war hero, and he is somebody who is revered nationwide by any and all, which will be opposing parties. Alexander Hamilton called for a meeting in Pennsylvania, so they met there at the Philadelphia Convention, or not for the Constitutional Convention. They also voted to conduct the meetings in secret. That means they closed all the shades, they closed all the lamps. They weren't talking to people, they weren't talking to the press, they weren't talking to anybody. And then later on, they finally realized, this isn't working. Instead of just carving up the old Articles of Confederation, let's create a new constitution. And so that's what they decided to do. They decided to draft a brand new constitution. And James Madison is going to be the primary writer of our constitution. So again, every state but Rhode Island sent delegates, 55 in all. Most were lawyers, most incredibly talented. Only 8 of them were signers of the Declaration of Independence. And George Washington, as I said before, was chosen the presiding officer, and they were closed to the public. They voted on that. Instantly, we are in disagreement. Under the Articles of Confederation, each state had 1 vote. And big states hated this because they thought, why, since we have the majority of the population, why can't we have more votes? Whereas the small states loved it. Obviously, they thought that it was more equal and more fair for them. So 2 states proposed plans. First one was the Virginia plan. Second one was the New Jersey plan. So the Virginia plan, the idea is based about representation. So the what we are dealing with now is representation. Who is going to be represented and how are they going to be represented in Congress? So Virginia plan called for bicameral legislation, both of the houses based on population. Upper house would be the Senate, lower house would be the House of Representatives, but again, they would both be based on population. The Virginia plan said that the upper house, the Senate, would be elected by state legislators, not the people. So the people would elect state legislators, and the state legislators would then vote in the Senate. A lot like what the British plan is, House of Commons, House of Lords, and from within those groups, you get the Prime Minister. The lower house, House of Representatives, is going to be voted based on population, voted by the people based on population. So the number of representatives you get is based on population. So it is proportional. It's proportional representation is what it's called. Small states hated it. Small states are like, well, then we get nothing. We don't have any power at all. And so they come up with their own plan, the New Jersey plan. Their goal is to make the central government stronger and give powers that were originally not given to that. So what they wanted is a unicameral government that is based on equality. So it is every government is equally represented in the states. That means if you have 10 million people, you get the same number of representatives as if you have 10 people. So it's not proportional. So what was the compromise? And this is what we're going to be kind of our theme for this is the compromises that create our Constitution. The Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Plan, called for 3 branches of government to spread out the power. Executive, judicial, which they did not have in the Articles of Confederation. But one of the houses is going to be based on population, and one of the houses is going to be based on equality. So the upper house and the Senate is about equality. So that is kind of the New Jersey plan. You have 2 representatives that represent each state regardless of population. So large state California has 2, small state South Dakota has 2. The lower house, House of Representatives, is based on population. So large state California has 50-some, small state South Dakota has 1. So it kind of equals out the representation within those. And then later on, we're going to be talking about voting. So here's kind of what the goals of each are. You can stop it and pause and read it if you want. So the fear of the common man, and these are legitimate fears. One, you are indirectly electing the senators. So they go with the Virginia plan that the senators, the 2 senators for each state, are going to be elected by the legislatures in the state. So citizens elect people to represent the district in your state. So it'd be like the people that we send up here. They would then choose the 2 senators that we send to Washington, D.C. So the first Constitution called for that. And so the fear is the election of senators. It could create corruption. It's going to be somebody who donates the most or gets the most. It's not really who the people choose. It's who the people chose. And usually the people that the people choose are rich and do not always represent the common man. You're also indirectly electing the president. We're going to be talking about this later, but the president is indirectly elected because of the Electoral College. We essentially vote for electors. If you look at the which we still have today. If you look at the ballot for the 2020 election, it doesn't say that you're voting for Donald Trump or Joe Biden. It actually says you're voting for the electors for Donald Trump or Joe Biden. And so each state is not directly elected. It's not popular vote. It's based on electoral college, and we can argue that all day long. That's the way it is. The other problem with the fear of the common man is that judges are appointed; they're not elected, and they're appointed for life. So we've been dealing with that the last few years, probably 5 years, since even before Donald Trump was elected president. But what do we do for the judges? I mean, it's a lifelong position, and none of them are voted on by the people. So in reality, the typical American is really only allowed to have a direct voice in a quarter of the branches of government. You could elect the House of Representatives only, not judges, not senators, not president. So that's the fear of the common man. Other compromises, the infamous 3/5 compromise. So the question came up is, what do we do with the slaves? So we have all these slaves in America. What do we do? Do we count them as citizens? Do we count them as slaves or as property, which is what the South claimed that they are? So here's the thing. The South wanted to count them as people because they wanted the number of representatives. Because remember, if the House of Representatives is based on your population, they wanted to count the slaves as people. That way they get more representation, less likely for the government to then abolish slavery. So the South wanted them to count as full people for voting purposes, but no people for taxing purposes. And the North wanted to count them as no people, since you consider them property for representation, but full people for taxes. So a couple things that I said. So if you look at this meme, and I know I teach with memes a lot, but I thought you said all men were created equal. So this idea of 3/5 compromise is in direct disagreement with our idea of from the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. The other thing is that, and I argue in this one, that this is from Civil War or Endgame, but the South used the slaves to keep slaves. And the idea behind that is they use the slaves to get representation, and by getting more representation, those representatives were not going to vote to get rid of slavery. So they used slaves to keep slaves. The South compromised by committing to end slave trade by 1808. And so instead of counting them as zero, they agreed to end slave trade by 1808, and they will. Other compromises. There was a couple of compromises with trade. The North wanted a federal government to regulate foreign trade and interstate commerce. The South thought that the federal government was going to tax agricultural exports. And so the commercial compromise allowed Congress to regulate foreign and interstate commerce, but prohibited taxes on imports. So they were worried that they were going to tax agricultural products on exports. However, the compromise said, yes, we're going to regulate interstate and foreign commerce, but we're not going to tax exports. We can tax imports to protect our companies, but not exports. The other one is the presidency. The presidency was a compromise that was created. Some people worried that the president was getting too much power. And so they did not want, so obviously we created 3 branches of government that check and balance each other out. But we also want to select the president from outside of the legislature. So what the British do is they have a House of Commons, House of Lords, kind of like our Senate and House of Representatives. But they then elect their prime minister from within that group. So 1, we created a president that is outside. 2, they limited the president's elected terms to 4 years that have no limit on the number of terms. But they're not elected for life. They're not put as king. They're not, it's not a lifetime position. So they limit it to 4 years. That way, if the president does become too powerful, the people can just vote him out. We also created electoral college, which is to prevent mob rule. which there's a lot of different definitions for mob rule. Most people choose to believe which one they want to believe. So how's the Constitution set up? Well, we have a preamble. We have 7 articles. So that is our original Constitution. The preamble is simply just the introduction. It states the basic principles and purposes of government. It says the authority of the government comes from the people, with the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States. So we, the people, ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States. The 7 articles really just go over who has power. Article 1 talks about the legislative branch, creates Congress. Article 2 talks about the executive branch, creates presidency. Article 3 creates the judicial branch, Supreme Court, and other federal courts. And so we set up those. The argument was whether or not we need a Bill of Rights. And so another compromise is going to be the Bill of Rights. And this is going to lead us into the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Federalists thought that we don't need a Bill of Rights. The Constitution and our ideals, our American and Republican ideals, mean that we are not going to have too much power. The people still have the power. Anti-Federalists are like, no. We don't want to happen. We don't want to have happen what happened with the British, where they took the power that they were given, and it just was not good. So Federalist Papers, Anti-Federalist Papers, we did an activity on that. That is on Classroom. But the idea of Federalists creating a strong central government that is still run by the people. Anti-Federalists were afraid that the strong central government was going to be too strong, and that we need a Bill of Rights. So here's the answer key for the one that we did, the activity that we did. So in the end, the compromise that was created was that we were going to have a Bill of Rights, and that Bill of Rights will end up being 10 amendments. They originally proposed 12, but only passed 10. The 11th will become ratified later on, but that's neither here nor there. I think it was 1992 is when it gets ratified. So here's the freedoms of the First Amendment: religion, press, speech, assembly, petition. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. That's the First Amendment. Basically says the government cannot make a religion or keep it from practicing the one you choose unless it breaks the law. Of course, press, we need a press around so that it keeps the president and the government in check. It's kind of another check and balance. Speech, we got to be able to talk how we want, which we'll talk about this one at the very end. Assembly, as long as it's peaceful, and then petition, you should be able to tell the government what you want. Second Amendment, we know Second Amendment. So the Second Amendment says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So the reason why they needed this or wanted this is they needed to form a state militia. They were worried, and most people at the time in the late 1700s, they were fearful of a standing army. They were fearful of a federally regulated army. So they were fearful of the military. And so they knew they needed a state militia. They knew they needed people that were able to use firearms. And so that's why the Second Amendment is in there, is because they were afraid of the government and the military becoming too powerful. And so they should be able to use their own or have their own guns and keep their own guns and be able to shoot them and all that. Third Amendment is no quartering of soldiers during peacetime. No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a matter to be prescribed by law. So we haven't used this forever, but if we were ever attacked, let's say the Chinese or the Koreans or the Canadians attack us, and we need to house soldiers, they need permission of the government first, or it would have to be something that the Constitution is created to do. Fourth Amendment is protection from unreasonable searches and seizures. This is another. If you look at these, almost all of the 10 amendments that we have, at least the first 8, were in response to what the British had done. And so the Fourth Amendment, protection from unreasonable searches and seizures. You have to have a warrant based on probable cause. Those are all in direct relation to what the British had done to us. Fifth Amendment, double jeopardy. You don't have to self-incriminate yourself. I plead the fifth. You also cannot have punishment. They cannot punish you without due process of law. You cannot go directly to jail. You have to have a trial first. And the last one is eminent domain, which means the government cannot take your property without just cause and just compensation. Sixth Amendment is a bunch of different stuff. Speedy and public trial, jury of your peers. You have to be told of the accusations against you. So you have to be told why you're being accused of crime. And you have the right to question the witnesses against you. So witness protection program, that's why. Because if somebody testifies against somebody who committed a crime, the person that committed the crime has the right to know who they are, as well as assistance from lawyers. So hopefully you've never been picked up, but if you have been, you've probably been given the Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent, which is Fifth Amendment. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law, Fifth Amendment. You have the right to an attorney, Sixth Amendment. So that's straight from the Constitution. Seventh Amendment allows you to settle civil lawsuits in federal courts with a jury, as long as it's $20 or more. Eighth Amendment, no cruel and unusual punishment or excessive bail. Ninth Amendment, and this is really protecting them. You may have other rights in addition to those listed here. Some people were worried that, well, if we list certain rights but don't list others, that means we don't have those rights. Is that a question mark? And so the idea that the Ninth Amendment says, no, you have other rights. And this has been used numerous times, specifically for like gay marriage. I think it was DOMA was another part of it. There's transgender rules. I think Roe v. Wade used Ninth Amendment. So there's been a lot of different times that they've used it. And then 10th Amendment says that it basically takes away power of the federal government and gives it to states. If it doesn't specifically say it's for the federal government and it's not denied to the states, that means it belongs to the states and the people. So those are your Bill of Rights. So Washington is elected president. He is our first president. Electoral College had 2 votes each. So you're not voting for president, vice president, you're actually voting for president and president. Whoever gets the most votes is president. Whoever gets the second most votes is vice president. Washington received at least 1 vote from every state. And so he unanimously was chosen. John Adams received 34 electoral votes. And so he becomes the vice president. So you now have president and vice president. The cabinet is a strong cabinet. This is an absolute strong cabinet. Thomas Jefferson, who's going to be Secretary of State, he was in France for most of the war. Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of Treasury. We know who Alexander Hamilton is. Henry Knox is going to be your Secretary of War, which you probably don't know who he is, but he's a big deal. Edmund Randolph, another big deal. So this is like the who's who of this. A couple things that you need to know about Alexander Hamilton's economic plan. Here are the things that it did. One, the federal government is going to assume states' debts. And that means that the states, since in the Articles of Confederation, had the power. They're the ones that traded. They're the ones that incurred debt. They're the ones that really fought the war. The state militias are the ones that fought the war. And so they have a bunch of state debts. So Alexander Hamilton said, why doesn't the national government, the federal government, assume states' debts, pay off all of our national debt? That way states don't owe. So let's say Virginia owed money to France. Now they owe money to the federal government, which protects the federal government and it protects Virginia. Because when you owe money to people, they have a little bit of control over you. It placed tariffs on imports. This is protectionist tax. Essentially protect American businesses, protect American industries, collect money through tariffs. So that way, the tariffs on imports is something that a lot of presidents do to protect American businesses. I use the example in class. If I create a shoe company and I can buy shoes for $10 a pair from China, but the government's going to put a 25% tax on that. Now I'm paying $12.50 a shoe. If I can find somebody that in America that makes the shoe for $12 or $12.50, then I'm going to more likely to go through them rather than going through China. It sounds all great, but you obviously worry about the retaliation because we need to also trade. So we trade specifically agriculture and other things to other countries, and we're worried about tax that they put on us. It's not the government that pays the tax, it's the company, it's the business that pays the tax. Excise tax on whiskey, this is a big deal. It's going to become a big deal, especially for farmers. They put excise tax on alcohol, specifically whiskey, and it's not going to like it. So they're going to try to sell government bonds. So selling government bonds, it raises money for the government. It raises money. It's money that you have to pay back, yes, but it raises money for the federal government right away. And the last one, probably most important, is that he wanted to create a federal bank, a national bank. The first national bank of the United States is created. Speaking of compromise, in order to get the national bank, he had to compromise. He had to move Alexander Hamilton agreed to move the capital from New York to Washington, D.C. And the whole argument was, is this right? And Jefferson argued that the national bank is not right. It's unconstitutional. It's giving the government too much power. Whereas Hamilton argues, well, the Elastic Clause gives me that power. Foreign affairs, some things that happened during the foreign affairs. We know that the French Revolution was going on, a revolution to overthrow the monarchy and establish a republic. The French Republic was at war with European monarchies. Many Americans thought that the United States should support the French and they supported us. Jefferson argued that the United States should fight with France against the British because the British were seizing U.S. ships that were bound for French ports. Most merchants wanted to avoid war with Britain because they're a good trade partner. And so they didn't. So we created a proclamation of neutrality in 1793. We basically said we are neutral. And this is going to force Jefferson to resign as Secretary of State. He's not happy about that. He thought we backed out on our friends. We also have the Jay's Treaty. In order to keep peace with the British, John Jay was sent by Washington to stop the British from seizing U.S. ships and impressing the U.S. sailors, which impressing U.S. sailors is basically taking them and you're saying to our sailors that you're fighting for us. In the treaty, they agreed to remove troops from the western frontier, but didn't say anything about impressment. Most people hated the treaty. Most people in America thought it was very unpopular. But one thing it did do is it maintained our neutrality. And then Pinckney's Treaty was a treaty with Spain that opened up Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans. This was very popular. Some domestic affairs, we fought kind of the final battle, the Battle of Fallen Timbers, with the Native Americans, and we opened up Western lands. Jay's Treaty, Fallen Timbers, kind of opened up the Western lands. We create 3 new states, 1791, 1792, 1796. The Whiskey Rebellion was a big deal. The Whiskey Rebellion, farmers were not happy over the excise tax on whiskey because that they needed grain, they needed farmers or agriculture, and so they refused to pay that excise tax. They attacked tax collectors. They just were not happy. So in response, Washington sent the troops. Well, remember how I said most colonists were fearful of the government using troops, using the military for their own gain. This was kind of an argument there. So power of government, this shows the power of government to enforce the federal or enforce laws, whereas the Articles of Confederation did not have that.